the results are similar. Chinese participants increased their trust of the robot when the robot communicated implicitly. For American users, things are different. American participants decreased their trust of robots if the robot communicated implicitly. This is very interesting. In the previous studies, these are findings for interacting with people, not about robot. But in this study, this result is associated with a robot. So if you want to design a robot to interact with people, to provide information, to help people to make decisions, we need to consider if we want to design the communication in a different way or not, and how. And if you want Chinese to trust the robot, the communication style can be more indirectly. And the second study showed Chinese change their decisions more when the robot communicates implicitly. Meaning, first of all, Chinese participants trusted the robot and they change the decisions if the robot communicates in an implicit communication style. Again, this finding was associated with people to people. Right now, people to robot, the same. But our implicit robot was not able to convey some very subtle communication cues in Chinese culture. Robots to be seen as credible sources of information in high context culture. So designers may want to consider, may want to think more about the ways to influence, to design the robot's nonverbal communication style. In both studies, the two robots are not so intelligent, not so good enough to convey those subtle communication cues in Chinese culture. And remember, in some other cultures, there could be some more subtle communication cues. I still remember, one time, I and my Korean student and my Indonesian student together celebrating their graduation. They successfully passed the defense examination and had their degrees. When we drank together, my Korean student wasn't so happy. And we asked him, what happened? He said, my Indonesian classmate, not so good. What happened? When we drink together, you are a professor. When we drink together, we cannot enjoy our drink that much like we enjoy with our friends. Our point should be you. And my Indonesian classmate didn't do that. So I am a little uncomfortable on that. Those are very subtle communication cues. Not about verbal communication, not about languages. It's just about body languages when you have a drink. And also, after the experiment, we interviewed the participants. A large majority of the Chinese participants somehow saw the robot having some intentions. Meaning, the Chinese participants in the experiment consider the robot, consider the intention of the robot for their decision to make. But when we talked to the 160 American participants, most of them didn't think so. Actually, the robot in the second study wasn't intelligent enough to manipulate people's decision. The robot could only give measures, readings, or pre-programmed recommendations. Even so, Chinese participants still wondered, still tried to guess the intention of the robot. But actually, the robot was not so intelligent. There was no special intention on either one of the decisions to make. Anyhow, why Chinese prefer a robot communicated implicitly? Culturally, normative communication style could improve Chinese participants' trust on the robot and consequently increase their decision change in response to the robot. A culturally normative communication style appears more familiar to people, which may increase their perception of the speaker's intention. And how about group orientation? How about the manipulation of group orientation? Actually, in the second study, it wasn't so successful. It wasn't so easy to convince people the robot is in your group. I think the robot does not look like in-group member, but in the future, it can be. But some way, somehow, we still see the trend. Chinese participants consider the robot communicated implicitly as more like an in-group member, more in-group oriented. So again, the results actually raise more questions. Do people from in-group with a robot differently versus with a human? So more research questions bring up by the results. How to improve people's perception of in-group members with a robot to trigger more positive attitude and higher trust? Will more culturally normative cues lead to increased perception of in-group members? These are all interesting questions to answer. To conclude the findings of the two studies, I think obtaining a broad and dynamic understanding of culture can be important to human-robot interaction. How to develop practical knowledge of how to adapt such knowledge into the design and development process can be a challenge to human-robot interaction, to development of robot technologies. Finally, one interesting observation about culture and robots. Try to search online about Chinese food and robot. Chinese food is very important to Chinese people. There are Chinese research teams develop robots for this very important thing in the culture. Cooking Chinese food. Cooking Chinese food is not easy. And cooking Chinese food is very important. And we've got robot technologies. Okay, put them together. Search the web. You will have some very interesting findings.